So time to parse the incoming request and get the data that is part of the request, because that data should be whatever we entered here. Now, how do we get access to that? Well, we got request URL and request method. You might think there is something like request data, but there isn't. Instead, the incoming data is basically sent as a stream of data. And that is a special construct JavaScript in general knows, but Node.js uses a lot. Now, what is such a stream of data, though? There is a connected concept, buffers, and we'll have a look at both here. So let's take our incoming request as an example. There also are other streams, like for example, when working with files, we can also work with streams, but let's stick to requests here. Our stream here is basically an ongoing process. The request is simply read by Node in chunks, you could say, in multiple parts. And in the end, at some point of time, it's done. And this is done so that we theoretically can start working on this on the individual chunks without having to wait for the full request being read. Now, for a simple request like the one we're working with, this is not really required. We only got one input field data. It doesn't take so long to parse that. But consider a file being uploaded. This will take considerably longer, and therefore streaming that data could make sense because it could allow you to start writing this to your disk, so to your hard drive where your app runs, your Node app runs on your server, whilst the data is coming in, so that you don't have to parse the entire file, which is of course taking some time, and you have to wait for it being fully uploaded before you can do anything with it. But this is how Node handles all requests, because it doesn't know in advance how complex and big they are. So you can start working on the data earlier. The problem is, with your code, you can't arbitrarily try to work with these chunks. Instead, to organize these incoming chunks, you use a so-called buffer. A buffer is like a bus stop. If you consider buses, they're always driving. But for users or customers being able to work with them to climb on the bus and leave the bus, you need bus stops where, well, you can interact with the bus basically. And that is what a buffer is. A buffer is simply a construct which allows you to hold multiple chunks and work with them before they are released once you're done. And you work with that buffer. Now that's pretty abstract, but it's pretty easy to work with, fortunately. So let's see how that works in practice. When receiving a posted message, before sending the response and before writing to the file, we want to get our request data, right? And we do this by going to our request and registering an event listener. We haven't done that thus far, but as I mentioned, Node uses these heavily. For create server, it implicitly creates one for us. Now we do this on our own by using the on method. Now on allows us to listen to certain events. And the event I want to listen to here is the data event. You see my IDE even gives me some help here and tells me which events I can listen to for a request. So here I want to listen for the data event. The data event will be fired whenever a new chunk is ready to be read. You remember that buffer thing? This is basically helping us with that. Now here, we have to add a second argument, which is that function that should be executed for every data event. You remember create server? It had a similar concept. There we defined a function that should be executed for every incoming request. Now we're defining a function to be executed for every incoming data piece. So here I'll again use a ES6 arrow function. You could also use the function keyword without that arrow then. And as you can also see on data, this listener receives a chunk of data. So here we receive a chunk. And this chunk is something we can work with here. And now we have to do something with this chunk to be able to interact with it. For this, I will create a new constant here. And I'll name it body because I'll try to read the request body. You can name it however you want, but it is the request body we're working with. Now, the body should be an empty array. And now in that function here, in the data event, I'll take my body and push a new element onto it. By the way, if you're wondering how we can edit a constant value, this only means that we can never reassign a new value. So we can never use body equals something again. But with push, we're changing the object behind that body element, that body object. We're editing the data in that object, not the value itself, not the object itself. It's a bit strange to wrap your head around, but this is in the end how it works. So we can now push a new element into this array to make it non-empty, and we push our chunk here. Now, Node.js will execute this so often until it's done getting all the data out of our request. That can be once, that can be multiple times. And we can even log this to see how often it does this and what's inside of this chunk. Now we need to register another event listener, and that is the end listener. This will be fired once it's done parsing the incoming request data, or the incoming request in general. Here it will again execute a function we define as a second argument. And in this function, we can now rely on all the chunks being read in. And they're all stored in the body now. Now, to interact with this, and don't forget the comma after end, to interact with that, to work with all these chunks, we now need to buffer them. Remember that bus stop concept? We got all these chunks. We now need to do something to be able to work with them, to basically have one place where the bus stops and we can interact with it. So here, I'll now create a new constant, parsed body. And there I will use the buffer object, which is available globally, made available by Node.js. And I can concat my body. So this will in the end create a new buffer and add all the chunks from inside my body to it. And then on this buffer, which I got here, parsed body is now a buffer. There I can call toString to convert it to a string. So this is a utility method offered by Node.js where we do something to our buffered chunks. Remember, the bus is now waiting and the bus stops, so to say. The buffer is our bus stop. And now we do something with it. Here we convert it to a string. And this only works because I know that the incoming data will be text, because the body of that request will be text. If it were a file, we would have to do something different, but it is no file, and I know that it isn't. Because we're writing the code, we know what we will receive, right? So this is the parsed body. And this is now finally what we can work with. So let's also output the parsed body. This was a lot of talking, so let's simply have a look, quit the server with Ctrl+C and restart it, and then send another request with some message here. And now, if you have a look at what's being logged, you see two elements. The first one is coming from this console log, and you see that is a chunk. That is a chunk we can't work with. But now the parsed body receives or yields this line, and that is something we can work with. And its message equals something because we named our input here message. And as I said, that form will automatically send a request where it takes all the input data and puts it into the request body as key value pairs, where the names assigned to the inputs are the keys and the values are what the user entered. And that is what we have here, a key value pair separating the key from the value with an equal sign. Now, and with that, we can now work with that and finally store the input in our file. And we can do that here in request on end to be precise, by creating a new constant message, taking the parsed body and splitting it on the equal sign, and then taking the element with the index 1, which is the second element in the resulting array, which is the element on the right of the equal sign. And now we can move write file sync into the end function. We don't want to execute it here because this will actually run before this function is called, because here we just register a function to be called in the future. It's not executed immediately. Remember, Node doesn't wait and pause. It will not block the script execution. It just registers this as a to be executed action and then right away continues. So if we have something that depends on the incoming data, we have to move it into the event listener too, so that it's also part of the to be executed code, sometimes in the future, and doesn't run too early. And now we can write message to the message.txt file. Let's now restart this file one more time and enter hello here and hit send. And now if you look into message text, we see hello. You see the exclamation mark was encoded. Now that is something we can worry about later, but in general, this worked just fine. And if you're now totally frightened by how complex Node.js is, this is the raw logic. We'll later use Express.js, which hides all that raw logic. But to understand why we use that, you first of all need to understand what is happening and why using tools like Express.js, which will make all of this much easier, are great. So with that, we got our basic logic down. Let's now dive again into that event listener and writing files thing, because there is something really important you have to understand.